And I'm a PhD candidate with the Faculty of Education, but the reason I'm here is not because of that. I'm also working for the Center for Teaching and Learning at the University of Alberta, and I work as an educational developer. And you do have access to our services, so if you ever want to come in for a consultation, do consultations at a distance as well, feel free to contact us. My email should be at the end, but it's ellen.watson@ualberta.ca. I tend to spend my time working in the area of assessment, and that's primarily because my background is a high school teacher. So I worked in a high school in Lloydminster. We were located on the Alberta side, but it was Saskatchewan curriculum. And we spent a lot of our time doing aligning of our curriculum and aligning of our learning outcomes, and so it was a natural fit for me to spend most of my time working in assessment here. So Diane has asked me to come and speak to you about formative assessment and feedback. And just before I get started, can I get a show of hands who is aware of the term formative assessment? Okay. And who currently uses feedback in their classrooms? Most of us should have our hands up, because even if you give a number, that's feedback. Throughout the presentation, I do encourage questions, so just shoot your hand up and, well, don't shoot it, but put your hand up and ask me anything that is related, and I'll try to answer it as best I can. So, of course, we have our learning outcomes, so I'm looking for you to be able to define formative assessment if you can't already, and feedback. Identify the benefits and the challenges, which most of you will be familiar with these already. Decide whether or not this is for you and how you may use these strategies. I also get into rubrics a little bit at the end if we have some time, and then we talk about self and peer feedback. So a few definitions. Formative assessment it falls under assessment for learning. So I think of it as formative means I'm informing, okay? You're giving feedback to someone, you're giving some information to your students, you're also getting information for yourself about how the students are understanding the concept that you're working with. Typically, this does not have a numerical grade assigned to it, although you could argue that some of the assessments that we use throughout the year are formative. So for example, if you assigned a mark to a project proposal, that would be both formative and summative, because you can't change the grade, so it's summative, but you're giving lots of feedback to improve on something else, so it's formative. And then summative is what we typically think about when we think about assessment. This is going to be anything that is worth a grade, and it's unchangeable. So things like your exams, if you have them submit a final project, is going to be summative. Anything that summarizes their knowledge for you. Okay, so you're either informing or you're summarizing. Any questions on that? I have lots of slides, so I'm just going to kind of fire through them. But I would like you to open up this webpage if you have an electronic device with you. And I'm going to give you a little test on formative or summative. You could also go to Summative.com if you like and choose student login. That'll get you as well. Or if you have a Summative app. Does anybody use Summative? Or Summative? No? Okay. And then it's going to ask you a room, and then room name is Watson Room. It should take you right into the place.
Sorry, I put B-O-Y, not B-Q-Y.
Oh, when you typed it in.
Yeah, you see the little curly Q thingy at the bottom.
Should not underlined it.
I need to
Just if you want to see what it looks like. And I can actually pull up how everybody's doing, but I'm also showing you the answer at the same time. So. Let's just see who's done. So for those of you who like to bring EdTech into your classroom, Summative is a nice tool for student response systems. It's free for up to 40 students. You can have 10 different rooms, so you can have 10 classrooms and run different student response rooms. If I could have an idea assigned to each of you so that I could keep track of your grades throughout the term, if I chose to, but I left it as anonymous just because I'm taking information. And I'll use this as a bit of formative assessment, right? Just to see how we're doing. Okay, so I had 2 people get 100%, and most of you checked off correct answers, but we missed E for some reason. So then what I would do is go back and I might look at the quiz and see what's E and why are we having trouble with it. Oh, an exit ticket. So an exit ticket would be a formative assessment. Now, are we familiar with the term exit ticket? No? Okay, which is why we might not have chosen it, right? So an exit ticket would be, for example, on a Post-it, you might have students write down what are the 3 important things you learned today. Or you may ask a question at the end of class saying, can you tell me in 140 characters, so like a tweet, how this concept relates to what we discussed yesterday. Okay? So you're just getting a sense of what they've gotten from the class. And then you'll collect those. You can either collect them digitally, so some people use Twitter for exit tickets. You can also have Post-it notes and just have them stick it on a wall on the way out. But that way you have an understanding of how students are learning this concept, and if you need to review something from that day. And so for me, knowing that, okay, we were typically able to get B and E, but I needed to review F, that's how I'm going to use my formative assessment, right? I got a little bit of information and then I'm going to use it. Somebody also chose C. It says a final project. Why would that not be an example of a formative assessment?
You get a grade for it.
You get a grade for it, right? Also, typically when students submit a final project, they can't submit it again, right? It's just one thing, they can't resubmit.
Question.
Yes.
So why is the final project not formative that the proposal as a final project is?
The proposal would be formative because you're giving them information on how to improve their current product. And it gets kind of messy when you start to break those things down. So for example, technically everything in a first year class is not summative because it's preparing them for the next class, right? But in order to make those lines a little bit easier to draw, I would say things that you're giving information to improve upon their next product is going to be formative, and anything that you're attaching a number they can't resubmit is going to be summative. Does that answer your question?
You're assuming that the proposal will be used going forward.
Yes. Yes. So that would be if you submit the proposal and then you have to submit the actual project later.
Gotcha. Okay.
Thank you. Yeah, Diane.
If I could just add.
Of course.
It's the idea that the proposal is proposed, which gives the instructor an opportunity to make adjustments to the student's thinking before they get to the final paper.
Yeah.
So it's sort of a snapshot of what the student's thinking at that moment in time, which you can then adjust if they look like they might be going off the rails a little bit.
Yeah, or even give them suggestions on how to continue, or give them comments on where they're struggling right now and they need to turn. Okay, so let's talk about actual feedback. I call it formative feedback. I tend to just say feedback because feedback is used with formative information. But this is anything that accelerates student learning. Then it says based on your comments. So when we think of feedback, we often think of marking the essay or the paper or the technical project and writing lots of comments on there, right? And yes, that is certainly one form of feedback. Another form of feedback is, like I showed you with the response system, because it gave you information on how well you understood that concept. Okay, so you don't necessarily have to have that written piece. Here, Irons uses the words based on comments, but it can also be on informing your students on how they're doing. Okay? Okay.
So it could be like showing the right answers in an e-class quiz.
Absolutely, it
So
could
that
be.
would be feedback.
That
And
would
then-
be feedback.
But there's a mark attached to it, they got whatever, 50%, but if you show them the right answer.
So that would be feedback on a summative assessment, right? And by showing them, oh, sorry, maybe I'm talking too loud, Yvonne. By showing them how to regulate that difference, so how to check what you got wrong, and connecting that to perhaps a learning outcome, for example, and having students say, oh, I'm struggling with this learning outcome because I got all the questions on that learning outcome wrong. That's powerful feedback because now they can go and look at that learning outcome. And if you're interested in how to connect your assignments and your learning outcomes, that's another presentation, and I can go down that road, but I would encourage you to come and book an appointment. But yeah, something as simple as showing them the right answer is feedback. Did you get it right or wrong? And here I bring up the point of definitional fuzziness, right? So you often give formative feedback on a summative assessment, and in K-12 when we were working on this, we had rewrites of exams on there. So technically a rewrite is, or technically an exam is summative, but if you let them rewrite it, is it really summative because you're giving them information? And it just gets really messy when you start to go down that road. So for now, we're going to try and stick to the hardest lines that we can. Okay, so I would like you to pull out your piece of paper, your blank piece of paper. You should have one. And I'm going to show you an image, okay? And what I would like you to do in 3 to 5 sentences is write a description of that image. I saw some of you were taking notes. If you were taking notes, you may want to get another blank paper. But don't put your name on it, because I'm going to take this paper away from you. So, 3 to 5 sentences. No, it's Thank you. I meant to explain that. No, I didn't. With the Google file. I'll give you about 1 more minute. Okay. Get you to finish your thought. Some of you wrote very in-depth descriptions. All right, so I like to try and incorporate moving into my activities, so this is going to feel a little silly, but I will ask that you all participate. If you could take your description and crumple it up, please. Have you seen this before today? You know what's coming? Okay, and you have, I want you to throw your paper to another place in the room. Normally we would have a snowball fight, but I want to move on. So throw your paper to another place in the room. Not to a person, just to a place. Normally I would let students have a snowball fight. So now I need you to get up and find a paper that is not yours and go back to your seat. Which is fine. That's So I wouldn't recommend, I'm not sure how large your classes are here, but I wouldn't recommend a snowball fight with about 100 students, but with about 20, it's good, and first-year students particularly enjoy that activity. So taking a look at that description, what I would like you to do is provide some feedback on it. I've still got the image up here for you. And I'll give you about a minute and a half.
Wait, what are we supposed to do?
Provide some feedback on the description.
Is it based on how well they describe the image?
Provide some feedback.
All right.
Your handwriting.
Yeah.
Create your own rubric.
Provide some feedback on the image. You're giving away my punchline, guys.
Oh, no.
All right, I'll get you to finish your thought. Are you ready? Okay, I'll grab your attention back up here. What are some things that you commented on?
Content.
Content? Okay.
Language.
Language. What about language?
Accuracy.
Accuracy? Okay.
The original assignment criteria was met, if they met it. So
If they met it?
3 to 5 sentences.
Okay, 3 to 5 sentences. Good. Yeah, that's great. Let's take one more.
Continuity.
Continuity. Good. Did anybody comment on grammar?
No.
No, that's usually a common one. Did anybody comment on? You wanted to. Okay. Thank you for being honest. Did anyone comment on pen color choice? No, because I know that some people were writing with like light orange and light pink colors. Those are hard to read. So, but realistically, because I didn't give you assessment criteria, which you all wanted, which is good, you were just free to comment on whatever you like, right? So, of course, the next piece is talking about feedback and how you need to connect it to criteria. But first, what are some benefits to giving feedback?
You draw attention to specific points.
Good, yeah. So you say, this is a point that I want you to improve, or a point that you've done particularly well.
Students can you create a space for reflection to motivate them to think.
Interesting.
You also focus the students' efforts as well. You direct their attention to what you think is more important. They can focus their efforts on what
It's also important to differentiate between the delivery. So in face-to-face classes, I might see your face and recognize that you're not exactly happy with my choice. But if I'm online, I might not know that. So overt feedback in the different blended versus online versus face-to-face makes a lot of sense for students depending on where they are and how physically separated they are from you.
Got a message from Brian who states that it establishes a learning and teaching relationship. So
Absolutely. One
Attitude and perspective.
more? Tell me a bit more about that.
The personal biases that some students might have towards
And you're able to bring
Subject.
attention to that?
Yes.
Or, okay. Yeah, all benefits to feedback, right? Especially that when it's nice when it's face-to-face because you can make it a little bit more personal, but if you don't know that student, then, you know, to try and develop that dialogical relationship is important.
And that can be done online. I mean, most of my teaching's been done that way, but it's a different skill set
It's trickier for sure.
than you would say in a face-to-face classroom.
Okay, some challenges. Let's hear four challenges for feedback.
The attitude of the student and the teacher and the instructor. So is the attitude of the teacher welcoming that feedback? And is the attitude of the instructor giving that feedback so that it can be used constructively in the future?
So you're talking about when a student gives you feedback?
Either or.
Okay.
When I'm giving the student feedback, how are you receiving it? Are you ready to
Reception.
receive it? And am I giving it to you so that you can improve? Or am I giving it to you to point out what you've done wrong?
That can be hard, especially when you don't know how the student receives feedback, right? Okay.
Making it accessible so that it's clear and understandable, very concise.
Oftentimes we know exactly what we're trying to say, but they may not.
It has to be packaged in such a way that they'll want to receive it. Like you could say, not even close, you're not getting this. Or you can say, okay, we're on the right track, however, right? You can say it's the exact same thing, but how it's packaged is what it will accept.
And there's one more.
The articulated directions or instructions in terms of what it is that you're looking for.
Feedback is a hard thing to give, and it's hard to be constructive and positive, but not overly positive when you're not supposed to be positive, you know, like, and it takes a lot of time. Feedback takes a lot of time to give really good written feedback. So some of the stuff in the literature here for the benefits are that it's actually one of the most powerful things, being shown to be one of the most powerful things in student learning is feedback. It's not their marks, it's not how they score, it's the feedback they get to improve. Now it's recommended that you teach students how to use that feedback. Again, that's another presentation and not something that I'm going to go into. If you're interested, Cosette has one on it.
Yeah.
But teaching students how to use feedback is a whole separate piece. Right? You can empower students to work on self-regulation. A big issue out there right now that they're talking about in K-12, in medical education, you're also seeing it start to come in higher education, is this idea of metacognition and teaching metacognition and teaching self-regulated learners. And teaching students how to use feedback is a way of teaching self-regulated learners. And feedback can become formative for you when you start to see how you can change your teaching to meet those needs, right? So when you get in those exit tickets and you look and you say, oh my gosh, they didn't get what I was talking about at all, you know that if you move on, they're probably going to be even more lost and you need to go back and deal with some of those misconceptions. So the challenges, here's the big one, students want a grade. Right? They don't necessarily care about all of this feedback that you're giving them. They just say, so how did I do? Oh, I got an A? Perfect. I know everything about this assignment and I can move on. They might see this comment as they may see the comments as a way of you justifying the grade. And this is a danger for the instructor as well. If you look at a paper and say, oh, this is about an 86, then you start to tailor your comments to justify why you're giving it an 86, right? One strategy for this, and I'm not sure if it comes up later in the presentation, but is I actually used to give students back their marks with their papers with comments on them. And if they wanted to get their mark on the paper, they had to come and meet with me. So I would just post it on Bear Tracks eventually, but if they wanted to know it like a week earlier, then they would have to come and meet with me to see the actual grade. Or you can consider giving comments on the paper and then posting the grades a week later, for example, because that way students will interact, and what they're going to likely do is interact with that feedback and say, oh, I probably got about a C based on what he said, but at least they're going to read the feedback and process it, right? We do a lot of assessment here in North America. We almost over-assess our students, right? If you think about in a term, if students are doing 10 quizzes, and then they're doing a midterm, and then they're doing a major assignment, and then they're doing a final exam, and that is common. And then there's participation rate. That's a lot of assessment for one class. So with all of this assessment and grades being the currency, they start to worry about these grades and not so much about how they're doing. Now your clientele may be a little bit different in some of your courses. They might be a little bit more concerned with how they're improving, but this is a big issue in higher education. Students might not know that it's feedback. If you go into a class and say, hey, on assignment 2, these are some things that I noticed. They may not recognize that as feedback because it's not addressed directly to them. Okay? So when you're giving that feedback, it might be a better way of saying, on assignment 2, these are the things that I noticed. Check if you made these mistakes as well, right? Or check where you had these positives happen. Students need to be trained on how to review their own work and feedback, and there's limited opportunity to enter dialogue. We've talked about that, right? You write them some comments, and they take it away, and if you don't talk about it again, you assume they took the comments until you get the next assignment and they make the same mistake, right? So like Diane said, you may want to get into that relationship.
One of the things that I find, especially if you're creating feedback to the mark, is that you've got your rubric, you make your adjustments, you sort of say, okay, you sort of fit here on the rubric, and here are some generic comments. But what I find really useful is that I'll say something in a feedback to the student, which I then anticipate they're going to get back to me. Mm-hmm. But a lot of instructors feel uncomfortable if the student comes back and says, I don't understand why I got this grade when you said this or when you said that. So I'm just wondering how they might deal with that.
Well, when someone comes and has questions, it can feel like you're having to justify yourself.
Right.
Again, right? So the best approach there, like you said, is generally saying, this is the comment I gave you, this is an elaboration on that comment.
Yeah.
And teaching students how to work with comments instead of saying, I don't understand why I got a C.
Well, often it's a case of also showing them an example of it. Mm-hmm. So I will say, there was an error in this sort of thinking. And they'll come back and say, well, I don't understand where the error was. And that's when then I'll dig into that particular student's particular work to make sure that they know that this is the section. But I don't necessarily spend the time to identify it directly. So
and that's a challenge in feedback.
It is. It is. And then sometimes I'll do it because I'm interested in whether or not they'll come back and ask specifically. I want to start that conversation.
Well, and sometimes we identify those students that will come and ask. We identify those students that will come and make us justify every little mark that we give them. And do you tailor feedback more to them? I don't know. We have limited comments that we can give. And if you give comments that don't suggest how to improve, they're often useless to students, right? Saying, this is terrible. You're not actually helping them, right? Instead of saying something like, you know, you really struggled on this concept, you might find it helpful to read, bam, bam, bam. These are all of the things that you could do. Feedback may be inappropriate, you know, when you have those assignments that you notice you're just ripping into it, and then you think, I should probably give this person some positive feedback. But if it's positive feedback to make them feel better, it's not helpful, right? At that point, you need to start looking for, okay, what did they do well? And I'm going to comment on that. And providing them in a timely manner is difficult because it takes a lot of time and they want the paper back tomorrow. So it can take some time as well. So in the literature, they recommend that it's not necessarily how you can be amazing at writing feedback, and it won't matter unless the student knows how to engage with that feedback. So having students actually engage with the feedback makes things a little bit more beneficial. One example of that is an actual conversation, but feedback, like Diane said, should be a two-way conversation. When you give students a question, they should be coming back to you. You can design this into your course with small reflection assignments that go back to the originals. You know, sometimes people assign a small mark to actually interacting with feedback. You could also have it set up where students have to come and meet with you and you talk about the feedback, or giving them a chance to come and meet with you even if they don't have to. One example that I like to bring up, I tend to take a lot of my assignments in on Google Docs, because then I can go in and comment on students' work and they can access it. So when I was teaching in K-12, one student, it gave him a notification on his phone, and so he logged into the document and we were able to chat while I was grading it. And then he asked, you know, oh, before you grade this, can I go back and change something? Well, sure, I'm only half done, so go ahead. And then he changes it, and then I would give any other student the same opportunity if they were to log in while I was grading it as well. So those kind of things can happen with online, and it's a little bit nicer for me than paper, because with paper I find that you give it back to them and they don't look at it again. Okay, so how do I engage students with feedback? I breeze over this again, that's a whole presentation, but you need to teach them how to use feedback. Some things that you could do is involve them in the feedback process. So ask students what they want you to comment on. Okay, you've mentioned rubrics. I'm going to bring up rubrics at the end. I use rubrics for all my assignments, and I'll ask students when they hand it in to attach a rubric and star the area that they want me to comment on. And so I'm going to spend my time commenting on the star area, but if I notice some big gaps in the other areas, I'm also going to comment on those. So with younger grades or younger students, I'll ask them to star the area they want me to comment on. For older or more advanced students, when I'm teaching 300 and 400 level courses, I'll ask them to star the area they think they need the most help with, or they think that they're struggling with the most, because they're a little bit more resilient and can handle a little bit more criticism. Like I said, provide feedback but no marks, or delay the marks. Require assignments to be self-assessed. So you might have students hand in, I use rubrics a lot again, but you might have them hand in a rubric with their assignment where they have to highlight how they think they've done, or you may meet with the student and they have to identify how they've done, or perhaps they have a peer identify how they think they've done. And then I don't typically use the student mark for the actual mark, or the peer for the actual mark, but I'll use it as a discussion point. Say, hey, you gave yourself this and I gave you this. Let's talk about the difference between that. Or I think you're being too hard on yourself here. You actually do a really good job of this. And I find typically students undergrade themselves. They don't often overgrade. And using two-stage assignments, so perhaps they have to submit their assignment. You give them feedback on that, and then they can resubmit that assignment again, and you give them a grade. Okay. That's a great way of getting students to interact with feedback, and you can give it as an optional piece, right? If you want to get feedback on it, you have to submit it by this day, and then you can resubmit. If you don't need that feedback, then you just have until this day, the second day to submit. Any questions so far? You guys know this stuff, right? Okay, so demotivating feedback. If you are giving the student feedback that they see as unfair, if it's unclear, unspecific, or unrealistic. So if you have a 100-level student or a first-year course student and you're asking them to read 15 papers on a concept, that's unrealistic, right? Not only are they likely not going to be able to access those papers cognitively, they're also not going to be able to summarize them into that concept. So while you're writing feedback, you need to make sure that you are being consistent with all of your students, so it needs to be fair, not necessarily equal, and it needs to be specific and clear. What do you want them to change? How can they improve this? Okay? Be more sociological. Write more like an anthropologist. Think more like a business person. You know, those comments aren't helpful because they don't know how to do that yet. So if you're going to give them a comment like this, you need to teach them what it means to think sociologically. I actually got this comment once on a paper. If feedback's not timely, if they hand you an assignment and then they get it back 2 months later, they've already forgotten what they wrote in that assignment. So it needs to be quick. And you can't be overly critical. So like you said, you look at it and you think, man, they missed that assignment totally. Now you need to think about how you can get them to improve and scaffold their learning. You know, this is the next step without absolutely tearing them down, because then you don't want them to pick up their paper and it's like bleeding red ink, right? So, and if it's not constructive, so something like, this is good, and this is something that I am really bad for. When I find a good idea, I'll just circle it and I'll say, this is a great idea, but I don't actually take the time to write why I think it's a great idea. I'll just point it out because I'm trying to get through all of these assignments quite quickly. So it's important that even those areas that you're going to praise, you need to spend the time going into why you're praising that. Which is why it's helpful when a student tells you what they want you to grade, what they want you to assess, right, to give feedback on, because now you can spend some time focusing on one area. In our school division, we actually had an initiative one year called L to J, and I'm not going to get into the whole thing, but one of the aspects of it is you would take a rubric, and if a rubric had, say, 3 different criteria, when students handed in all of their assignments, you as a class would roll the die, and it would indicate one of those 3 areas, and that's what you would grade, is one of those 3 areas. Now, I don't necessarily agree with it in principle, but it really does cause you to focus on one aspect. And when you're focusing on one aspect, you look really closely at that because you have the time to go into it. I wouldn't actually recommend anybody roll the die like that, but for comments, you certainly could. And say, I'm going to comment on this, right? Okay, so feedback frameworks. These we're probably familiar with. One is called the sandwich method. So you identify the strengths, then you identify the weaknesses, and then you talk about the options for improvement. You always need to have how can they improve, okay? You know, it's or you can say, you know, positive, critical feedback, positive. You'll also see that if you write it in a big paragraph. I like to think about it as having your I run through a paper and write down strengths first, and then I'll write down weaknesses, and then I'll write down options for improvement at the end. Sometimes I'll use 2 different pens on strengths and weaknesses. But another method is called interactive feedback. So this does take a little bit more time, but you'll ask students what they think went well, so you could have them submit this with the assignment or on a rubric. Say what you think went well, and then ask what could be improved. Say what you think could be improved, and then discuss how this could happen. So this, as you can see, almost needs to happen in a conversation, whether that conversation is online or via paper, going back and forth. That way you're actually asking the student to engage with the feedback while they're going through, right? After they've identified what went well and what you say went well, okay, now you can talk about what it needs to be improved. And wouldn't it be nice if we all had the time to do that? But if it is something that's key to your area or a key concept in your course, it's worth spending the time on those discussions. Okay. So the couple points I want to point out here, we've talked about feedback, so you get something in and then you give them a feedback on it. But the two things that we need to talk about as well are feeding up and feeding forward. So that's your improvements. So giving information on where they could go or what to improve next. You as instructors also receive feed up or feed forward. When you know how well students are doing on a concept, you receive that feedback. It tells you how much deeper you can go into the next phases, right? And we'll all tailor our teaching to how our students are doing. Okay, so just a show of hands before we get into this, how many people are using rubrics? Do you know if they are analytical rubrics? Does anybody know that term? No. Okay, perfect. So I like to work with analytical rubrics, and they're probably what you know. Oh, Brian raised his hand. Yes, Brian.
I guess Brian must know what an analytical.
Oh, Brian knows what an analytical rubric is. Thank you, Brian. Okay. So we're going to talk about analytical rubrics, and before that, we need to know what the criteria are, right? So criteria are based on learning outcomes or other predefined criteria. Based on university policy, you need to have your assessment aligned with your learning outcomes, which means that you need your learning outcomes written. You have to assume, don't assume that students understand the list of assessment criteria. So if you hand them out a rubric or you say, this is what you're going to be marked on, don't assume that your students understand what that means. You have to go through what each of the topics mean, especially things like argument, evidence. They may not know what that means in your class. And you might need to develop a dialogical process so that they know academic terms if you're using them. Okay. Oh, and the last piece, like Diane said, if you provide examples or a more thorough understanding may be achieved through exemplars. So an exemplar meaning an example of that work. I'm not sure if does the 30% criteria apply to you? Do you know what I'm asking? Evaluative material.
As in nothing more than 30%?
No. So by the university policy, you have to, anything that's worth more than 30% in your course, you have to provide evaluative material, meaning you have to provide some sort of representative material in that assignment. So for example, in a final exam, people might provide sample questions that students would find on a final exam that's worth more than 30%. But if it's a major project, like let's say you wanted them to write a business proposal, you should provide them with an example of what a business proposal might look like.
We generally do that anyway.
Yeah.
Like we'll put examples of, say, an example mini quiz or an example for the final or an example for the case study or whatever they're working on. I generally try and keep final assignments or any assignments under 30%, or 30% at its max, because it just, it puts too many eggs in one basket for a student. And in some cases, our students, depending on where they are, so if they're in our English language school, they might be working over 10 weeks, 8 weeks. If they're in our occupational health and safety, they might be 4 days, or 2 days, or 4 weeks.
Yeah.
So it's all over the place. So I try to keep the assessments fairly, not any one too high.
Yeah, which is a good practice, right? On campus, we are limited. Your final exam must be worth 30% unless you get exemption from GFC. But again, I'm not totally familiar with the policies here around that. But it is a good practice to provide evaluative material anyway. So if you have an example of a student project that they've used last year, be sure to get consent to see if you can share it, and then you may want to share it. Another good practice, teaching students to actually evaluate or critique assignments is, say, I'm going to go to that business course, so say you're writing a business proposal. If you have business proposals from the previous year, names blacked out and anonymized, and you have one that's really good and one that's not so good, and then you can actually have a discussion about why an assignment is better than another one.
I'll often use more than one exemplar, because if you use one exemplar, students think that is the exemplar you want them to follow. So unless it's a template, something that you actually do want them to fill in and follow a particular process, I usually recommend more than one example, because otherwise they just assume that's the path you want them to take.
Otherwise, they all look the same.
They all look alike.
And that's not what we want. We want creative thinkers, right? So, Okay, we're gonna go back to our activity. So you have, using the same assignment, I want you to establish 3 criteria to structure your feedback. So let's say at partners or tables, I want you to take a look at this image. And I asked you to write a description of this image, okay? So I want you to write down what are the 3 criteria that you at your table are going to comment on.
We have more paper here if anyone needs.
I'm not going to take this paper away, so this new paper you can keep.
All right.
Come join us.
We'll on over.
I would say there's lots of good chances for.
We're just doing the first block right now.
What are the things that
What are you going to do your 3
how
criteria?
well I could picture
I like that idea, criteria, get a first criteria, because the
how
person
well
knows
the
they went into details on
and
the
very well.
supporting the apple, one of them.
Yeah.
Almost not even so much literally, like describing what it is, but kind of doing.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And the use of colors. Yeah. That's the real description.
Maybe what you just started to go but another one could describe it well, but it just wasn't much design or describe how do you evaluate how color?
There's a lot of color there and variegated colors.
So 10
Subset.
same thing.
Like something
Creativity
So I don't want you to worry about actually writing the comments, it's just your criteria.
Creative is much different. So I just wondering if I want to give this one. So yeah, like yeah, like if we
No.
Okay.
So, but that could be or more literally summarizing. It's a more scientific.
Yeah.
Well, I just
Say
use
with
that.
the
And there doesn't have to be a writing it down. It's more how that makes. It doesn't have to be, my friend doesn't match up to your descriptions, but it can justify.
So kind of the language again around the feelings, so how
All right, just because of time, I am going to call you back. So some of you actually wrote on your description, so I can't do the next piece, but that's okay. So what I would do, the next piece here, is that you would trade descriptions again, and then using your criteria, you would write comments on a new description. The reason I would choose to make you trade again is because some of you may have chosen to write criteria down based on the description that you read, right? And that's really common, is that we get these assignments, we read through, and then we say, this one is excellent. And then you write down the criteria based on that assessment. That is terrible practice, and I'm sure none of you do it. So we're not even going to talk about it. But what, your criteria may change year to year based on the themes that you're seeing come out of student work, right? And that's okay. But you should have these criteria set out before. I actually do a whole workshop on rubrics. And part of it, I can't do it now because I'm going to tell you the punchline, so you can't see it. But it's on cookies, right? So I ask you to write a rubric on a cookie. So you write down this rubric to say what the best cookie is. And people usually have softness and taste and number of chips per square inch for the scientists in the room. And then I'll give you a cookie. And I'll say, okay, rate this cookie on your rubric. And if I give you a store-bought cookie and you said good cookies are only soft, right, and I give you Chips Ahoy, my cookie is immediately going to fail your rubric. So the point of that is give your students the rubric before, so that they don't hand you in an Oreo when you're expecting a chocolate chip, okay? So here, it's easy to base our criteria on what we're seeing now. It's harder to establish criteria prior to an assessment. So we're going to skip that. So be sure to have a dialogue on feedback, whether that's with a TA, I'm not sure if you use TAs here, or it could be generic if you have trouble writing to each individual student. These are the large areas that I found. Did you see these in your paper or your assignment? They can be individual, so via email, maybe you use Moodle, maybe you use video. I wrestled competitively in university, and our coach used to write us 3 to 5 sentences on a piece of paper, and he would cut them all out, and he would give them to us at the end of practice once a semester. And it was feedback on how we were doing in our sport. Because obviously you get the feedback of whether you're winning or not, but he would give you feedback based on, I think you need to improve here, and these are some of the moves that you're working on. And we would just get this piece of paper while we walked out of practice. So it can be as simple as that. Release your feedback before a grade, and you may have a small mark associated to students responding to feedback. Okay, I'm going to skip some of this because. So, does anyone in here use peer feedback? A little bit? Okay, so peer feedback I find quite useful with rubrics, where I'll give students a rubric and I'll say, okay, can you mark this person's paper based on this rubric, and they're going to mark your paper based on the rubric, and then you're going to get together and talk about it. Okay? I will not use peer feedback as a grade, because in our policies it says that the instructor is the one in charge of the grade, so it tends to get a little bit sticky when you allow peers to mark it. You may use it for a small portion, but I would offset that with your assignment as well. But peer feedback is, I was just reading a paper yesterday, which I didn't have time to put in here, but it has actually been shown to be more effective than instructor feedback. So students respond to peer feedback better than they do to instructor feedback, because it becomes more of a dialogue instead of them just listening to you, right? So they think that you know all about this subject, and so whatever you tell them is going to be correct. But in peer feedback, it becomes more of a discussion back and forth with it. Okay, so I am just going to talk about rubrics really quickly. This is an example of an analytic rubric. This is likely what we're familiar with. Yes? Okay. So you have your criteria, you know, what am I going to mark the assessment on? Okay, here are my quality statements. This is how good I think it is, and then you have your numerical statements at the top, your levels of quality. A few things that I do want to point out about rubrics. It's great to give numbers, but I personally like using ranges. So instead of saying this is a 5, this is a 4, this is a 3, this is a 2, I will go with 5 or 4, 3 or 2, 1 or 0. Because I wind up giving half marks, and it gets really hard to pick where they are. Whereas this way I can say, you've met all of these, but you're still hitting a lot of these, so you're probably a 4, right? You're not quite a 5 yet, because you're not hitting some of those small pieces. Analytic rubrics take a long time to write, but once you have them written, if they're really clear like this, they can help you avoid all of that written feedback, right? You just write a little bit of feedback on top of what you've highlighted, and it tends to make things a lot more efficient for you. So a couple of things, and it looks like you guys have bought into rubrics, so I'm not really worried about this, but lots of people worry about handing rubrics out because they're worried that it's going to make students produce one type of assessment. And if your rubric is written in such a way that only one type of assessment will get them the high marks, that's what you will get. But if you write a rubric in such a way that can incorporate creativity and can incorporate critical thinking and justification, then you might get a little bit of, you should get a little bit of variation in your assignments. The other misconception is rubrics are for instructors only. I'm not sure what it's like here, but at the U of A, people just don't want to hand out their rubrics for some reason. They don't want to give them to students at North Campus. So, and I don't know why, because if you don't give students a rubric, you're going to get an Oreo when you ask for a chocolate chip cookie, right? And then students totally miss the mark, and then they fail, and then there's mark argumentation and anyway. So if you're not comfortable giving the full rubric with the quality statements in there, at least give them the criteria so that they know what they're going to be assessed on. And by judging by most of your faces, you are comfortable with giving them the rubric, so that's good. Okay, that talks about, sometimes you can have students create their own rubrics, so I have done that. It takes a long time to have students create their rubrics, but if you have a small enough class and they understand the content well enough, you know, especially on a capstone course, for example, or a final course before they leave a program, you can spend some time actually building the rubric with them, and they really know what it means then because they spend time talking about those terms.
Do you do it with the goals, with the learning goals, and the students then the rubric?
Yeah, so I'll have the learning outcomes.
outcomes.
Yeah, and I'll say these are the learning outcomes. This is how I envision the assignment. What do you think are the criteria? They'll come up with the same criteria you would have anyway,
Okay.
because they come out of those learning
But
outcomes.
you use the outcomes always
Always.
with when you're doing that, so that they stay focused, because otherwise they may produce something that doesn't align with their outcome.
Yeah, and technically, you know, your rubric should, well, not even technically, your rubric should align to the outcomes anyway, because you really only
And then
assess
what
the
if
outcomes.
we put it together, but if we're, that's how I was asking.
No, and I'll guide them so that students wind up at, you know, the only things that might vary is some of the phrases that they use in the quality statements, but students are pretty intuitive and they know what's an A and what's B. It could even be better if you gave them examples. Right?
And one of the reasons why it's so critical to make the outcomes and the assessment actually match. And in fact, in some cases, when I've created a rubric or I've created a sort of a list of assignments, I'll actually say objective 1 and 4, objective 2 and 6. Like I'll actually tie them together. And part of the reason for doing that is we've all been in a course where we've walked out after an exam or an assignment and gone, where was that in the course? I went to every class, I read every article, I saw every movie that the instructor wanted us to watch, and yet there was a question on this exam that I have no idea where that came from. And so if you're not conscious all the time of tying your outcomes to your assessments, you end up sometimes with something that's in your head ending up as an assessment or ending up as an answer that wasn't in the course at all, but might be part of your long history of knowledge in the subject area. And there's the problem, because you end up not teaching that in the course.
And I find that, like Diane said, the easiest way to do that is to have various course maps and various levels of course maps. And if you're not familiar what a course map looks like, as soon as we're done this recording, I can pull you up a few examples that I have for courses as well as for assessments. So it might be a bit easier to see. So I guess my last slide here is my summary, but are there any final questions?
I'm wondering if you do any pre-planning. You know, I teach online, so I have a wide variety of students. And I use the personal introductions quite a bit, and I encourage them to tell me what their education and work experience and what their objectives are and courses that they've taken. And then when I'm grading them, particularly commenting, if I have a secretary who's been paid to take the course, you know, I'll give her I'll customize the feedback.
Mm-hmm.
Or a CEO, you know, a manager who just wants to familiarize himself with, or herself with the course. Or I have I develop I realize after a while I have a certain average or standard type of student, you know, and so I can, I understand proclivities and I can sometimes direct them in a different direction. Or expand their horizon. Usually that's my major challenge.
I'm not sure if this will answer your question, but I typically don't pre-plan my comments. I will write them based on the assessment and based on the student. As far as my pre-planning goes, my rubric will be my pre-planning. These are the areas I'm going to comment on, I'm going to highlight, and that's how you did. But beyond that, I will write to the individual student that I know. So your policy of writing different feedback to the secretary versus the CEO, I think is a good one. But if you have those common students that you know you're going to give similar comments to for all of them, there's nothing against having a comment bank, right? And a comment bank of saying, you're struggling with this concept, or I've noticed that you're having a little trouble with this concept, these are some readings you might consider, or these videos you might consider. And having those links already pre-built could certainly be beneficial for your feedback and for your sanity.
And the medium is the message. I mean, if you're teaching online versus in the class, you have different challenges there.
Well, and your students, while they do know you, if you're using personal introductions, they don't quite know you as well as if you were in a face-to-face, right? They can't picture what your tone is when you're giving that feedback. So those things do come back. You might consider giving video feedback if it wouldn't take you too much time. Or there was an instructor who gave podcasts, and she would read out podcasts while she was going through the paper. She would make comments so that students could take that, so that they could actually listen instead of reading.
I record a voice memo and send it to them. So the same, kind of like it matches the feedback that I've given in the paper. But they usually things that I know they would come and say, what do you mean the argument is weak? I explain in their recording, and then they can listen to it as many times as they want.
It's easier to do that than to type it out, right?
Yeah.
But if you had that prepared, your argument is weak, this is what I mean. This is an example of a weak argument. If you had it pre-planned, then it would be one thing. But so to answer your question, no, I don't pre-plan.
The pre-planning is quite, and I don't pre-plan either, but the keeping of the list of canned responses is actually quite useful if you get to teach the same course over and over again. Because I find that fundamentally there'll be 20% of the class will have this error in their answer, or they will have this kind of gap in their research, or whatever it is that I'm asking them to do. So I'll often have a document that sits in the area, and so sometimes I'll start to read an answer, and I'll think to myself, okay, I remember last year so-and-so did that. And then I'll go and take a look at the answers that I gave last year and just grab that piece and then adjust it to match the thing. But it's helpful because it takes me 2 or 3 seconds to remember I answered this student last year in a similar way, and then make an adjustment. But I think anyone who's experienced with teaching over years, teaching the same courses, will have built up those kinds of little helpful spaces. The difficulty comes when every term somebody gives you a new course to teach.
Yes. Yeah. So and in the literature they talk about it too. Keeping course banks is a positive. Keeping comment banks is a positive thing, as long as that's not the only source of comments.
I have a question. Would you have a suggestion for operationalizing terms in the rubric that might be open to subjective interpretation? For instance, in a 200 level course on a college essay, you might have to explain to a student the difference between A and A+. For instance, the category is level of thought. So an A+ essay, the thesis statement pushes the boundaries of the contention, the point of contention, and an A essay adequately addresses the two gaps. So the student might come to you wanting to know what is the difference between pushing boundaries and addressing adequately. And also, if you're peer marking with a colleague, you sometimes realize that their idea of pushing the boundaries might be different from your idea of pushing the boundaries. So are there any suggestions in literature to address this operationalizing the terms that might be open?
I don't have any pieces right off the top of my head. I do know that particularly vague verbs can be an issue, as well as those those descriptions that students aren't familiar with. So like you said, pushes the boundary. There is one reference on here that is a book about writing rubrics in higher education, and that will likely be your best bet if there's going to be any literature on it. But no, everyone's identified it as an issue and no one's figured out how to solve it.
Oh, they have.
No, yeah, my best solution would be discuss with students what, eventually you will know what those areas are that students have trouble with and talk about them in class when you present the rubric.
Yeah, so there's also, this is where subjectivity comes in, and you cannot always be, exactly sure of what the rubrics stand for.
Yeah.
So
But if you have operational definitions for each of the components of your rubric, I wouldn't see any issue at all with putting definitions with the rubric. So for example, if you say you've got a list of exceptional versus adequate versus, or above average versus not, don't pass this one in again. Then I would not have any issue with your choosing to define what that means, like giving me as a student what the boundaries are within that definition. So if you have a word that you're finding your students are having difficulty understanding, define it. Like actually define the operation from your perspective. And then of course you have to negotiate that with anyone you're co-teaching with. But if you're teaching it yourself, I wouldn't have any issue at all with your actual defining the concept for your students for that course.
Yeah, and I think with your particular example on the thesis statement, I might actually provide them examples of a statement and say, these are what I mean to match this, because this is why these statements are an A+ and these statements are an A. For that example.
And you could easily set it up so that it's not part of your syllabus or not part of your E-class, except that you could create a frequently asked questions FAQ section document. And then you could say to students, in advance of this, for the rubric, this FAQ will explain, or you can link it directly to the FAQ section. But in some way overtly create a place where their definition, where your definition and their understanding can meet. And then they can always come back and ask you to clarify if they still have issues.
Thank you.
So I think that's probably it for the presentation. The only thing that I'm going to show, I said I would bring up those course maps.